So this is either the end of things, or things are about to get very, very weird. It's possible that things get weird and then they end, but one of those two things is definitely going to happen now. In a movie, in a well-written book about a political scandal, what just happened today, what was just published today, would be the end of the plot, right? There's been a confession. The worst case scenario that anybody imagined at the start of this scandal has just been not just documented by investigative reporting, it is not contested to. It is not contested. It has been admitted to by the people who are involved and who are implicated. This is where plots end, right? Somewhere in a parallel universe, somebody's beach read novel about the biggest American political scandal since Watergate, and maybe the biggest political American scandal ever, somebody in a parallel universe reading this book has just finished their book. It's come to a tidy end. Now they're thinking maybe they'll switch to sci-fi for something more realistic the next time. But this is not a novel, this is not a movie, this is our real life. And now we have to figure out what is going to happen next, what ought to happen next, what is likely to happen next, now that the Trump campaign has admitted that they worked with the Russians during the campaign. The Russian government did meddle in our election last year to try to hurt Hillary Clinton's chances, to try to help Donald Trump's chances. The Trump campaign, after all those months of denials, all those vehement denials up to and including the president himself, the Trump campaign now admits that it knew that Russia was meddling in our election to hurt Hillary Clinton and help Donald Trump. They now admit that they were informed of that fact early on, even before the first news reports to that effect, and learning that that was happening, the Trump campaign's response at the highest level was that they tried to help the Russians in achieving their goals. Now that that has been conceded, what happens next? I mean, as of this time last night, the New York Times was reporting that its reporters had seen documentation that indicated that the Trump campaign knowingly took a meeting with a representative of the Russian government during the campaign in an effort to try to get damaging information on Hillary Clinton from the Russians. Since then, the Times itself and a senior Trump campaign advisor, namely the president's eldest son, they have published that documentation. The meeting in question happened last June. It previously had been a secret meeting. That secret meeting has now been made public, along with the circumstances of how it was arranged, via an email chain that explicitly spells it out more emphatically than anybody would have ever imagined at the start of this scandal. It spells it out more simply and more explicitly than any fiction writer would have ever tried to get away with. I mean, the quotes from the emails are astounding. Right? The Crown Prosecutor of Russia is offering to provide the Trump campaign with some official documents and information to incriminate Hillary Clinton. Very high-level and sensitive information. It's part of Russia and its government's support for Mr. Trump. They get that in writing. The immediate response from the Trump campaign 17 minutes later is, oh, can we do a call? And it turns out they can do better than a call. And within a week, a Kremlin-connected Russian lawyer who was described at the campaign as a Russian government lawyer, and also apparently her translator, they are ushered into a top-level meeting with the Trump campaign at Trump Tower, attended by Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, president's son-in-law, and Paul Manafort, the campaign chair. Credit to the New York Times for forcing this information out into the open, right? This is obviously the end product of a long, tough slog in terms of investigative reporting. At the same time, though, you didn't really expect it to arrive on a silver platter like this, did you? And they're not even 6 months into this administration, and they're confessing to colluding with the Russians during the campaign. Now that that has happened, it seems like there are two possible paths that this goes from here. I mean, again, I don't want to lose track of the big picture. In any normal political circumstances, we would be at the end already. This would be the end of the road with the clear admission of guilt. The worst case scenario, yeah, we did it. But it turns out, in real life, life goes on. So this is like we're standing at the edge of the pavement. The road has, in fact, ended. But now we've got to find, like, little deer tracks through the woods to figure out where we're going to go from here now that we got to go off-road. And I think there are two possible paths in the immediate future in terms of where we go off-road. Now that we've had a confession, what's next? I think there are two kind of hard to see, but I think the White House probably sees it as a clear choice, and I think we should watch for both of these starting to become evident. The first one to watch for is that the Trump campaign, Trump White House, maybe even the president himself, may try to turn this into a big counterattack that not just distracts from what they have just confessed to, but tries to make it into a competing scandal that hurts their enemies instead of hurting themselves. You're seeing the seeds of some of this already in the conservative media reporting on today's events. This meeting between the Russian lawyer and the Trump campaign was purportedly set up to discuss negative information about Hillary Clinton that's somehow related to Russia. You can already see the conservative media and some Republican members of Congress trying to turn the narrative to instead be about Hillary Clinton and her campaign, or to otherwise turn the story inside out. Tomorrow, there's going to be a confirmation hearing in the Senate for the Trump administration's new nominee to head the FBI, the man they want to replace James Comey, who the president fired, he says, because of the Russia investigation. Imagine the internal dynamic that has to exist inside somebody nominated for that job, right? On the one hand, I've been asked to become head of the FBI. On the other hand, I've been asked to become head of the FBI because the president just fired the last head of the FBI because of the Russia investigation. What's it like to go through that decision-making process to decide, yes, you're going to accept the honor of that nomination? So we will learn a lot more about Christopher Wray, the new FBI nominee, tomorrow. But at that confirmation hearing tomorrow, and also at the upcoming Senate hearings on the Russia investigation that we are expecting in the next couple of weeks, watch for Republican senators to try to mount a counterattack on the main narrative of this scandal. The Russian woman who came to Trump Tower and took this meeting with Don Jr. and Paul Manafort and Jared Kushner, at the time of her visit to the United States for that meeting, she was working on a legal case that was being handled in the Southern District of New York. It's related to Russian money laundering on a massive scale. That case links back to a scandal in Russia, to a U.S.-born businessman who had a major investment firm in Russia before the Putin government decided to turn on him and basically eat his business. Ultimately, U.S. sanctions on Russia resulted from that whole mishigas. Republicans and the Trump White House and parts of the conservative media are starting to signal that they are going to try to make that case, that Russian scandal, that money laundering case, the case that this Russian lawyer was involved in when she came to New York for that meeting, they appear to be gearing up to make that case itself seem like that's the real Russia scandal here. It does not make sense yet. I will not try to make it make sense here on TV, but if you're watching for it, you can see it. They have started to lob nebulous allegations about whether there's some connection between that Russian case and the dossier of unverified and salacious raw intelligence reports about Donald Trump that caused such a stir when it was first published by BuzzFeed this past January. Republicans and the conservative media have started to raise questions about whether there is something untoward or scandalous about how that Russian woman who came to Trump Tower and took that meeting got permission to enter the United States last summer to take part in that legal case about the money laundering on that same visit where she also took that meeting in Trump Tower. And I know that it just sounds like that was a list of dots without connections between them. That's how I mean to put it out there. There is no meaningful counter-narrative against what has just been confessed by the Trump campaign. But if you look at those data points, if you look at those other issues in the news, it appears that something is going on among Republican members of Congress and in the Trump White House and in the conservative media that they are about to try to land as a counterpunch, as they try to morph the Russia scandal involving the Trump campaign into something that instead is about Hillary Clinton and the DNC and presumably the Obama administration, and we think the FBI as well. When they try to make that dossier into the basis of the whole case against Donald Trump, and they try to link the whole FBI investigation to that dossier, where they are going with that is to try to undermine, to try to cast aspersions on the FBI investigation of the Trump-Russia affair, which continues to this day, by casting aspersions on its origins. Chuck Grassley, who is the senator who's the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, has been sort of the leader among Republican members of Congress on that subject. And he is the one who's signaling most strongly that he would like this to be the counter-narrative in this story. So watch for that. Watch for that in particular tomorrow at the Christopher Wray confirmation hearing, which will be chaired by Chuck Grassley. The Christopher Wray confirmation hearing is not supposed to be about the Russia scandal, but it will now have to be substantially about the Russia scandal because of the magnitude of that scandal now and because of the circumstances under which the FBI job became vacant, so Christopher Wray had something to be nominated to. So that is one possible path that we are about to go down. Watch for the Republicans, the conservative media, and the Trump White House to create a new scandal, to create something that sounds like this scandal, that has some of the same things involved, that certainly has Russia involved in it, but that's about Democrats and that's about the FBI instead of being about them. We've seen them laying the groundwork for it. I think we are likely about to see that break wide open. Path one. The other deer path through the woods, the other off-road possibility that we're about to go down is self-defense of a different kind, I think, from the Trump White House. As you know, there have been two big stories, two bombshell stories in the past couple of weeks about the appearance of American collusion in the Russian attack on our election last year. Wall Street Journal was first with their report on the admitted effort by a Republican political operative, who's now deceased, to make contact with Russian government hackers to try to obtain Hillary Clinton's emails from them so they could be used against her and for Trump's benefit in the campaign. Now, in that case, that project to try to work with the Russians against Clinton, that was a Trump supporter who mounted that effort. The link to the Trump campaign was that he claimed a relationship with Mike Flynn, the Trump National Security Advisor, and at that point, a senior advisor to the Trump campaign. Mike Flynn never commented for that Wall Street Journal story. He's never commented on those allegations, but the White House commented. They fairly readily threw him under the bus on that one. The White House comment to the Wall Street Journal about that story was that if Mike Flynn coordinated with that in any way, it would have been in his capacity as a private individual. Mike Flynn was a senior advisor to the Trump campaign at the time that project was underway, and that project was only about the campaign. So that defense from the White House beggars belief, but it at least kind of shows what they think their options are. It at least shows in that case they were willing to let Flynn take the blame for that rather than trying to defend the conduct. Now, in this second collusion story, theoretically, they have the same choice, right? You could defend the conduct itself, or if you can't defend the conduct, you kind of have to hive off the people who appear to be guilty of it. Hive off from the president, hive off from the White House, the people who appear to have done it. It's very hard to do that with the people who were involved in this new story. In that meeting in Trump Tower last June, and apparently in receipt of the email that described this as a meeting with a Russian government emissary who was coming to the Trump campaign with information from the Russian government to try to help the Trump campaign in its efforts against Hillary Clinton. In that meeting were Paul Manafort, who was then campaign chair, Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, and Don Trump, the eldest son. There's no way to use the exact same strategy that they did with Mike Flynn on the previous collusion story, right? There's no way to say, in this case, that Paul Manafort and Jared Kushner and Donald Trump Jr. were acting in their personal capacity when they took this meeting. We now know from what they admit about this meeting, what they have published about the origins of this meeting, and we know from the fact that all of them were in the meeting together, we know that this was clearly a campaign meeting. And so none of them personally can be on the hook without the campaign being on the hook. That said, in terms of their self-defense here, at least Paul Manafort and Donald Trump Jr., at least they don't have offices in the White House now. At least they are not current members of the administration. Jared Kushner is, though. And that means the potential legal jeopardy that may arise from this meeting. It not only enters the president's family. A lot of people have been talking about that today in terms of what we might anticipate about the president's psychology, about defending his eldest son if he's got real legal jeopardy here. The legal jeopardy here not only enters the president's immediate family, it also enters the White House, because Jared Kushner is still a senior White House advisor, even if the White House would not answer questions today about whether or not he still has his security clearance. But the Jared Kushner factor here lends some urgency, not only to what we expect to be a defense by the White House to these absolutely catastrophic revelations today. It also, for us as a country, lends some urgency to the legal side of this, to the question of whether and how this is prosecuted. I will explain what I mean by that in just a second, but Congressman Adam Schiff of California, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, he also spoke to this today in a way that I think was very clear and very chilling. Watch.
The most serious risk to the country, I think, is that the Russians possess compromising information, what they call compromat, that can influence this president's conduct of American policy. The Russians know about this meeting. They were behind organizing the meeting. If there are other meetings that the Russians know about, if there are other interactions with the Trump campaign the Russians are aware of, that is something they can hold over the head of the President of the United States. And the American people need to know that our president is acting on their behalf and not acting because he has a fear that the Russians could disclose things that would harm him or his family.
The issue is coercion. The issue is potential coercion exercised by a foreign power over people who are in very powerful jobs in the U.S. government right now. Everybody's expecting the Robert Mueller probe, the special counsel probe, to move very slowly, to unfold over a period of months and maybe even years. And, you know, politically, just in terms of our civic health as a nation, there's reason not only to expect that it will move slowly, but to hope that it would move slowly, right? To hope just for our ability to be resilient as a country in the face of a scandal like this. There's reason to hope that that probe goes slow, that it is deliberate, that it is clear to everybody, whether or not you start off as a Trump supporter or a Trump opponent. There's reason to hope that that probe goes slowly so that everybody agrees that no stone has been left unturned, that there is no question, but there was a diligent, thorough degree of due process, that all the evidence was examined and explained, every possible innocent explanation was explored, every little bit of exculpatory evidence was fully honored, right? If we're going to get to somewhere through that investigation that feels like a resolution, everybody has to be on board that that investigation was not rushed, that those investigators were not pushed along by political winds, right? That they did it and covered all of their bases. You want everybody in the country to believe that by the time that investigation is done. But there is also now direct evidence, uncontested evidence of people in the Trump campaign at the highest levels conspiring with a foreign adversary to influence our election. Now, whether or not the list of people in the Trump campaign who did that extends to and includes the president himself, it would appear to include at least one person who is working now at the highest levels of the White House as a senior advisor with responsibility for a lot of the most sensitive aspects of, say, American foreign policy. We learned about this meeting with a Russian emissary between Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner, who now still works at the White House. We learned about it from the New York Times. But the Russians, before the New York Times ever knew about it, the Russians knew about that meeting too. Have they used that to blackmail anybody before it became public today? Is there anything else that they know about in terms of the behavior of the Trump campaign, the behavior of Jared Kushner, that they are using or that they could use to blackmail, to exert coercion in order to get the United States to do stuff that is not in America's interest, but is in Russia's interest, because Russia knows what they did and they don't want it known? That issue of potential coercion, of Russia holding this stuff, lends urgency not just to the investigative reporting aspect of this, but also to the question of whether or not the prosecution here moves fast or slow. We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.